Leadership and Management Lessons from the Russo-Ukraine War. Hello, I am Colonel Doug Daniel, now retired from the U.S. Army. In my 33 years of commissioned service, I held 7 command positions. A commander in the U.S. Army is a general manager responsible for everything his unit does or fails to do. Of those 7 commands, 3 were in combat commanding special operating forces. But I was a reservist, so I had a parallel career. In my civilian career, I started as a mathematician conducting research in mathematics and physics in one of the U.S.'s national laboratories. Then I was recruited by a firm down in Silicon Valley and got into technical management at that point. Eventually moved into the executive ranks. I held such positions as manager of research and development, director of engineering, and chief operating officer. During that time, I discovered that the management and leadership techniques that worked in the Army worked in the civilian sector and vice versa. And in fact, I developed a procedure that I went through that I now call the Work Smart formula for helping junior commanders and less senior managers, and now I coach executives and use this particular technique to help them reach the objectives that their organization has agreed upon. So here is Work Smart formula. We start by clarifying and prioritizing in the objectives. Objectives in the military could be something like force the Russians out of Bakhmut, or perhaps destroy the Kerch Bridge. In the civilian sector, it's increase profits, accelerate growth, widen market share. Having decided what those objectives are and the priority to achieve them, we identify what obstacles may stand in the way of reaching the objectives and what risk areas that we need to accommodate. In the military, an obstacle could be a bridge that has been blown or a river that has to be crossed. A risk area could be an open area where my troops are going to be vulnerable. And so I need to make sure I cross that open area in a very reasonable and safe way. Then we lay out a management plan. In the military, it's called an operations order. That management plan has to be workable. After all, the people who execute the management plan are not the managers. It is the people who get the job done. The employees are the soldiers. So for the management plan to work, you have to identify the leadership techniques needed to make the plan work. And this is the area that I think, especially in the civilian sector, not enough time is spent focusing on the leadership issues because leadership techniques have to be consistent with the culture of the organization. And if you don't have the techniques available, or if the techniques that are needed won't work, your job as a manager is to modify that culture so that they will work, and perhaps increase your skill as a leader. And once all of that's been settled, we execute the plan. Executing the plan is an ongoing task. There's a saying in the military that no plan ever survived contact with the enemy. And if you think about it, suppose my objective is very straightforward. It's straight down that road. I'm going to get to Bakhmut if I drive down the road. So I'm driving down the road, and suddenly somebody starts shooting at me from the bushes. Well, I'm going to immediately change my plans because my knowledge of the situation has just improved, and I know the plan that I'm working on is not going to work. So always executing a plan involves assessing the situation, gathering the new information you have, and modifying your plan. In the civilian world, let's suppose it's an advertising campaign. So you've prepared, in the simplest case, 2 ads that you're going to run on Facebook. one of them is much more productive than the other one. So you quit running the ad that is not very productive and you move over to the ad that is productive and you modify that ad in a way that you hope will make it even more productive. That, by the way, is called innovation. To innovate, almost the definition of the word means doing things differently than other people do and that we have done in the past. To innovate, you must have the authority to make a decision, and you must have an environment that will tolerate mistakes, because most innovations don't work. Your skill as a manager at minimizing the downside of innovation is extremely important, putting a boundary around the things that can go wrong when you innovate, but still encouraging and allowing innovation, which means allowing mistakes. Those are the techniques that have worked for me very well. And so we're going to analyze, look at the Battle of Kyiv and see what lessons we can learn from that particular battle. Before it will make any sense at all, I need to quickly take you through the important events that occurred leading up to that invasion. And it basically all started in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. The Russian Federation was formed. The various Soviet republics were given the option of becoming independent republics or joining the Russian Federation, and Ukraine decided to be independent. But that left them with the world's third largest stockpile of nuclear weapons, which made the rest of the world a little bit nervous. The good news is Moscow had the launch codes and Kyiv did not. So that led to the Budapest Memorandum signed in 94, where the US, the UK, and the Russian Federation guaranteed that they would never attack Ukraine, either militarily or even financially, if Ukraine would give their nuclear weapons back to Moscow. And so they did. That same year, Russia invades Chechnya, and the West starts a pattern which leads to disaster, and that is the West complains but does nothing. 2008, Russians invade Georgia. West complains, does nothing. 2012, Obama tells the dictator of Syria, President Assad, that if he uses chemical weapons on his own people, he will, and I quote, have crossed a red line. The next year, Assad uses chemical weapons on his own people, and Obama simply complains. And then in 2014, Russian soldiers wearing green uniforms, but with no Russian markings to identify them uniquely as Russian, but speaking Russians, communicating over the radios in Russian, using Russian weapons, driving Russian tanks, invaded and conquered Crimea. Russia then deposes the legitimate government of Crimea and puts a puppet in charge. And once again, the West simply complains. So this leads to Viktor Yanukovych, who was the pro-Russian corrupt president of Ukraine, realizing the safest thing for him to do is to move permanently to Russia, which he does. And this convinces NATO that Ukraine is serious about wanting to become part of the West. So a very important thing happens that I didn't realize at the time how important it is, but we'll see that it is terribly important. And that is, NATO starts arming and training Ukraine. Then in 2021, Biden makes a major blunder. He completely screws up the Afghan withdrawal. The mistakes that he makes is that the people who are best able to determine how the withdrawal should be done and whether it should be 100% withdrawal or not are his National Security Council, the Pentagon, and the State Department. All of them advise him not to do it, that he should leave a small cadre of maybe as many as 2,000 people to establish stability. But he announces that he is going to do 100% withdrawal. As a result, the president of Afghanistan, having no confidence in his army, leaves Afghanistan. The government collapses, the army collapses, and the weapons that the Americans had intended to give to the Afghan army are left abandoned. The Americans do as much damage as they can to their own weapons, but they're not able to destroy all of those weapons before they have to get on a plane and leave. So the Taliban ends up with all of these high-tech weapons and quite possibly selling some of those weapons to potential enemies of the United States, such as Russia, North Korea, and Iran, so that they can learn as much as they can about how to defeat our weapon system. And of course, there were unnecessary deaths because of this chaotic withdrawal. Biden was not satisfied. A few months later, he announces there will be no boots on the ground in Ukraine, which is telling Putin, feel free to invade Ukraine because the United States will do nothing militarily to stop you. So nobody's surprised, the 24th of February, 2022, Putin invades. Well, we're going to try to look at this from Putin's point of view and Zelensky's point of view. And so I'm going to apply the first 4 steps of the 5-step Work Smart formula, assessing and prioritizing objectives, looking at obstacles and risk, developing a plan, and then what leadership techniques are going to be used to make the plan work. I'm going to do that from both Putin's point of view and Zelensky's point of view, and then we can go through what really happened in the Battle of Kyiv. Here is the ground. This is not a good map. I'll explain it to you in a little better and more detail, but the objectives that Putin had were quite obvious. That was he was going to capture Kyiv. Kyiv is the gray area down here at the bottom of the map, and he was going to capture Kyiv, arrest Zelensky, and put a puppet in charge of the government. And his plan was to drive from up here, the very top of this. I don't know how well you can see that, but that is, this is Belarus. He's going to drive down Ukrainian road M01 all the way down to Kyiv, and with an armored column. Armored columns are made up of tanks, armored personnel carriers, self-propelled artillery pieces, and all of the support trucks that are required to feed the troops, fuel the equipment, repair it, and supply ammunition and so forth. And then at the same time, he's going to, this is a zoom in on Kyiv. The gray area is Kyiv. Up here at the left, I'll draw a circle around it, is the suburb of Hostomel. There is a airport at Hostomel that Putin plans to fly his airplanes into so he can resupply through that and also bring reinforcements in if he needs to. And a leadership technique that he uses is he tells the entire world, including his army, that they're just on exercises. There's not going to be any war. Then when he decides to issue the command to invade, he tells his soldiers, Ukraine is run by a corrupt, fascist, Nazi government. Zelensky is a Nazi. Your job is to liberate Ukraine. to arrest Zelensky, and we will put a good, solid government, a Russian government, in charge to protect the people of Ukraine. And after all, Ukraine is not really a nation; it's part of Russia. And some of the soldiers believe that because there are reports that soldiers went into villages and asked where the Nazis were. Now, let's compare that to where Zelensky was. Zelensky had to be terribly worried and terribly frightened. Obviously, the war, where it was being attacked in three different directions all at once, had to make him very nervous. The country of Russia is three times the size of Ukraine. The Russian army, the Russian military at that time was thought to be the second most powerful military in the world, and they had nuclear weapons. Zelensky, I'm sure, was very worried. Putin, on the other end, So Putin's right again. Zelensky's objective is to stop the invasion. The risk are his obstacles are not enough munitions. His risk are panic on the part of his population, and that his soldiers just not up to the task. So the only thing he had working for him was leadership. So he decided he would show commitment to reinforce the will of the Ukrainians, the determination that they should fight and let Russia have their country. So the Americans offer to take him out because the Americans expected the Russians to succeed in three days to a week. I expected for the Russians to succeed in 3 days to a week. So Zelensky's response to the American offer was, I don't need a ride. I need ammunition. That simple statement was extremely important and profound. It really stiffened the resistance of the Ukrainians. Because if you compared him to what Ashraf Ghani's response was when the Americans offered him a ride out of town, the results were dramatically different. So Zelensky now dresses like a soldier, goes with the soldiers, talks to the soldiers, spends a great deal of time dealing with the soldiers. He tells them, I am one of you. I am not aloof. I'm not above you. I will share your risks. And he also proves his leadership skill by, he's told them, he's told his people he's going to support them and do everything he can. He demonstrates that with his diplomatic skills. Here he's seen making a charismatic speech to a joint session of the U.S. Congress. If you look at that flag behind him, it has handwriting on it. Zelensky had gone to Bakhmut. Bakhmut is the most intense battleground in this particular war. More casualties have been taken in Bakhmut by both the Russians and the Ukrainians than any other place. That battle has been ongoing for almost 8 months as I make this recording. So he asked his soldiers, write a message that I can give to the leadership of the United States. They did. That's the handwriting you see on the flag. And he is presenting it right now to the lady on the left is Kamala Harris. She is Vice President of the United States. In the event that the president is no longer able to serve, she becomes president. To the right is Nancy Pelosi. At that time, she was Speaker of the House of Representatives. So if Kamala Harris is president and no longer able to serve, Nancy Pelosi becomes president. So these are number 2 and 3 in succession to the presidency. Very important people. And Zelensky is sharing this flag with them. Great leadership technique. He also communicates daily with his country with the nightly television addresses. Another important management and leadership technique. Management from the point of view that the better your workers do, the people who are getting the job done, the more they know, the better job they can do. Leadership from the point of view of he's telling you, you are so important to me that I want you to know everything that's happening. I don't want you to be worried or anxiety-ridden. Now let's look at what happened in the Battle of Kyiv. First thing that happened is Putin waits too long. He waits until the spring thaws have started. The reason that's important is because tanks, APCs, and armored personnel carriers and self-propelled artillery pieces all have tracks. They need those tracks so that they can operate effectively across the countryside. But when the countryside turns to soft, gooey mud, they cannot operate in the mud. They need a firm surface, not as firm as a hard surface road, but they need either a frozen or dry surface to operate on. So these vehicles all the vehicles are restricted to the hard surface road. So the battle begins, and the armored column starts down M01 from Belarus toward Kiev when the paramilitary territorial defense forces, without receiving any orders from anybody else, attacks the lead of the column using NATO weapons and NATO tactics and the NATO organizational culture. That culture is you are, as a soldier at any level, you are expected to be able to make decisions, and you are expected to innovate, because if you don't innovate, you're predictable. And if you're predictable, it's going to be much easier for the enemy to figure out what plan they want to use to attack you. Using guerrilla tactics, also known as partisan tactics, the territorial defense force attacks and then fades away. And then they attack again further back on the column, and then they fade away. So that leaves the armored column stuck on the road for 5 days as they run out of fuel and run out of food. In the meantime, the Ukrainians are attacking and fading back into the woods, attacking and fading back into the woods. And a Ukrainian comes along and innovates. He uses a drone that was basically designed for making wedding movies, and it has a little release on it so that for the purpose of dropping confetti or perhaps rice onto a wedding party. He connects a grenade to the drone, flies the drone over the armored column until such time as he finds tanks with their hatches open, then gets directly over the hatch, drops the grenade hits the floor of the turret, explodes. The Russian tanks all have their ammunition stored up in the turret, so the exploding grenade sets off the tank ammunition, blowing up perhaps 30 rounds of tank ammunition all at the same time, instantly killing all 3 of the crew members. And the explosion blows the turret off of the top of the tank, sets the tank on fire, and the tank is now completely destroyed, of no value to anyone. Also, Russian special forces are able to take the airport at Hostomel. However, the Ukrainians rally and force the special forces off. Then special forces get some reinforcements and they retake the airfield. And then the Ukrainians, because they don't secure the airfield in the middle of the night, the Russians don't secure the airfield, Ukrainians plant explosives all over the runway, blow it up, and making the airport of no particular value. And The reason that the Russians are stuck on this highway M01 is because of their culture. They are trained to not make decisions. They are trained to do what they're told, the way they're told, nothing else, and don't argue about it. So until a Russian general was able to identify the situation and tell these Russian soldiers that they're free to take the hard surface side roads, they don't have to stay on the main road and proceed down toward Kyiv. They are stuck there for 5 days. Let me give you some good solid reasons to innovate and to act independently. In this particular battle, started on the 24th of February, the Russians invaded. A little over a month later, on the 29th of March, Putin orders a retreat. The results are the Russians lose 5,000 soldiers dead. The Ukrainians lose 162. Over 10,000 Russians are wounded. 748 Ukrainians are wounded. 4 different aircraft, Russian aircraft, are shot down. 1 Ukrainian aircraft is shot down. Over 700 pieces of military equipment are lost by the Russians, and the Ukrainians are successful at capturing more than they lose. Let me make the point that innovation only happens in the right organizational culture. And that organizational culture requires 3 things. It requires that decisions are made at the right level, that people have the freedom to make independent decisions. The corporation is willing to accept the risk associated with things not working out the way the innovator hoped them to work out. And another thing that is extremely useful to everybody is having not just top-down communication, but bottom-up communication. So let's look at the way Putin established his organizational culture. I'm sure you recognize by now that Putin has not done a very good job of building a winning organizational culture. Now, remember, his style is autocratic. He doesn't want people to tell him things that he doesn't want to hear. He thinks he's the smartest guy. He makes the clever decisions. He tells people exactly what to do and how to do it. And he doesn't expect any backtalk. I have a hard time imagining one of these young men walking up to him and saying, pardon me, Vladimir Vladimirovich, I think it would be wise to start your attack before the ground gets too soft. Not likely to happen. Let's contrast that with Zelensky in the act of establishing his organization's culture. He is sending the clear message, I'm in the fight with you by dressing like with the clothes that you would wear into combat. He's got a smile on his face. I have no doubt that he is talking to some of these soldiers, wants to know what they have to say, listening to what they have to say. And so let me tell you exactly how this works in a civilian environment. And it happens to be the way I almost started World War III. I was hired to manage a contract where the end user is a software contract. We're going to make software for NORAD. NORAD is the combined U.S. Air Force and Canadian Air Force military organization that is charged with the defense of the entire North American continent. And their main operations center, as you can see here, is built into Cheyenne Mountain. Cheyenne Mountain is a solid rock mountain made of granite, and they have dug a tunnel into it and this is the best they could come up with for a nuclear weapons proof operation center. The problem that we had to solve was to simplify the displays that these operators in Cheyenne Mountain have to look at. These displays have to be different. If you look at each one of the workstations, there are many different displays in front of the workstation because as each new radar technology comes online, there's a new display associated with it. Our job was to simplify the display so that a operator did not have to know or care whether the track that he was looking at was a result of a dew-line radar, air traffic control radar, airborne command and control radar, and the over-the-horizon backscatter radar, or soon-to-be space-based radar. We wanted them all simplified so there would be one track, and identify that track as a flock of geese flying over Alberta, or it's a formation of Soviet bombers coming, or it's ICBMs, or whatever it happens to be. They shouldn't have to know or worry about what the sensor is that is picking up the track. So a little history on this. I was hired by Dr. David Grubb, who had a very smart guy, PhD in nuclear engineering. He had designed the basic software system and estimated that it would take $400,000 to get the job done, and then had signed up with the Air Force to do the work in $400,000. So my first 4 days on the job, first 2 days on the job, Dave described in great detail his system, why he had the system, why it would work, sounded reasonable to me. Then I went and talked to the technical team and asked them to brief me on what they were doing and how it was going to work. I immediately came to two conclusions. One is that they're not doing anything similar to what Dave said they were doing. And the other is $400,000 is wishful thinking. So I worked with their technical leader. He and I were both very experienced software managers, and we estimated $4 million. So I was looking at a very short career at this organization. And my objective had gone from manage the software development and keep things on schedule to getting $4 million, not embarrassing my boss, and then certainly staying on schedule and in budget, because if I was able to get that $4 million, I could never go back and ask for any more money. I got on an airplane, flew from the West Coast to the East Coast, met with my counterpart in the U.S. Air Force, Lieutenant Colonel Schwingles. Colonel Schwingles, very reasonable, knowledgeable fellow. I laid out our plan in great detail. This is why our idea will work, and Dave's idea did not work. I made up an excuse to take care of, to cover Dave, to make sure that Dave was not embarrassed. And then I laid out my plan in great detail, covering all of the risk areas, all of the various, our architecture, our subsystems, how we would work around the various risks, how we would report to him, how the whole project would be managed, using all of the jargon that the Air Force uses in program management, because I had managed software programs for government customers in the past, and I knew exactly how to speak their language. So we got the money. I kept my job. Let me tell you about the results. We were on time, $400,000 below budget. There were no bugs ever. Now, being on time and under budget was what Ernie and I usually did. That was our profession. We were good at that. No bugs surprised me. Now, the reason there were no bugs, two reasons. One is is before I was hired, I had managed a project that was developing a software for autopilot. And obviously, software for an autopilot has to be absolutely bug-free, as Boeing has learned the hard way recently. Almost everyone owns some software that they've purchased and routinely gets upgrades, which are often bug fixes, security patches, and so forth. Sometimes they're adding features, but often they're also patching up bugs. I would point out from a business point of view, ordinarily, absolutely perfect, bug-free, bulletproof software is probably not good business. You probably get the product out there sooner as long as it's a viable product. You got to believe strongly in the minimum viable product, and that is not the perfect ultimate product. But in this case, it was a matter of national defense. It was important to be as good as possible. And because we had started with a budget of $400,000 and increased it up to my follow-on contract, I should say, was $8.9 million. That is a 2,225% increase in sales in less than 2 years. And we had a very good reputation. The advice that I give managers is under-promise and over-develop. I know that's hard to do because you're desperate to get the contract, but if you want follow-on business, you certainly have a lot more credibility if you under-promise and over-deliver. Also, because I was keeping people informed, because I made sure everybody on the team felt like they were on the team, that I was a member of the team. I had no employees, no contractors left. And I need to tell you that the technique that I used was weekly, or sometimes more often, I would meet with each one of the engineers to understand what they were doing, to make any suggestions if I could make the suggestion that made sense, tell them how important their particular subsystem was, how that subsystem fit into the big picture, made sure that their subsystem interfaced properly with another software subsystem. And again, when a design would be completed, we would hold design reviews, and I would get all of the software engineers in to listen to the design reviews, to see if we could find anything wrong with it, but to give feedback to the engineer without embarrassing the engineer. Give feedback typically by asking questions, so that the engineer has a chance to see his own mistakes. And that worked very well, as you can see. So we made a major contribution to the defense of North America, and I think that was one of the big motivators. But it almost started the Third World War. And let me tell you how I discovered that it almost started the Third World War. It's many weeks after we had delivered the software and it had been installed in Cheyenne Mountain and in all of the operations centers all over North America. We still had our bug tracking system set up and our configuration management system set up and so forth. We were ready to track bugs. They didn't come in. But I got a call from Cheyenne Mountain. The colonel called me up and said, you don't know me, Doug, but he said, you guys do write very good software. And there are times when I think maybe it's a little too good. I kind of took a deep breath and said, yes, sir. And how might that have been? He says, well, this morning we had a Canadian Air Force 4-star general, a U.S. Air Force 4-star general, in Cheyenne Mountain. We were showing them all the upgrades that we had done to the operations center when ICBMs started to appear on the radar screens coming over the poles, over the Arctic areas. There were also some high-speed aircraft headed at low altitude toward the New York City and Washington, D.C. So the duty officer, a 1-star general, had the red phone in his hand, and he was calling the National Command Authority operations center in the Pentagon to alert the president that we were under nuclear attack when one of the operators in Cheyenne Mountain recognized that we had left the software in the training mode. And so that's how close it came to starting the Third World War. Okay, so I want to leave you with this final thought. Which style do you think is more effective? The autocratic, I've got all the good answers. Do what I tell you. Tell me what I want to hear. Or the more democratic, I'm one of you. I want to hear your good ideas. I want you to make decisions. I'll make the decisions at the level that I'm supposed to make decisions. You make decisions at your level. I'll trust you and support you and do everything I can to get you what you need so that you can get the job done. So with that, thank you very much. Please like and subscribe.